So Malcolm, one of the reasons I was very excited to do this interview with you was firstly because you're a fellow Scot, but also you're a rugby fanatic. And I understand you're very much involved in refereeing with the SRU. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, like an awful lot of referees, I went into that side of the sport because I was too injured to carry on playing. And actually I found very quickly that I enjoyed it much more than I'd actually enjoyed playing, because you've got the combination of the physical challenge and the mental challenge. You need to be up with the game, but you need to make the right decision and you need to make it quickly once you get there. So I've had a career of more than 20 years of running around blowing whistle and, by some people's measure of it, spoiling rugby matches. But again, you know, as age and injury catches up with you and whatever, I've now had to transition. I'm no longer fit enough to keep up with the type of game that I would like to be refereeing. And like all referees, I'm not quite as talented as I hoped I would be. So I've now moved into coaching, and I'm coaching within the SRU structure. And I have to say I'm finding that incredibly rewarding. So working with some of the up-and-coming referees to try and just hopefully make them a little bit better and push them upwards, hopefully towards, you know, maybe even international work or whatever.
And what are the types of things that you're helping them develop? Are you helping them to make, you know, decisions under pressure? Is it about the? I mean, obviously there's a technical side to refereeing, but there's also a mental side. And it's about preparing for the match and also how you perform in the heat of battle, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the approach I've been taking with the referees I work with has been to focus primarily on getting them mentally prepared for the games that they're going into. I mean, all of them, without exception, are more talented referees than I was, and they're fitter, they're faster, and they're operating at a higher level of the game than I was able to do. But using my business background and my experience of people, then I'm working with them to try and make sure that they are going into a game with the right mental attitude and with the toolkit that means that when the pressure comes on during a game, they're able to keep themselves in the right mental space so that they can make the right decision, and again to make it quickly and accurately, and then working very closely with them afterwards to help them self-analyze. So a lot of the coaching is actually helping them to develop themselves more than it is me passing on pearls of wisdom.
And surely, yeah, there's definitely a crossover for the commercial and the employment world. When when you're preparing people to go into negotiations, to analyze post negotiation, what did we do well, what did we not? And do you think you've become better in the commercial space following your experience as a rugby referee coach?
Yeah, I mean, I actually felt that even while I was working as a trade union negotiator, I felt that what I was doing on the rugby pitch was actually very much helping me in terms of my mental attitude towards the negotiations that I was going into. It's definitely been helpful in terms of the mediation sphere, because you have a discipline of being impartial and not getting excessively emotional about the issues that you're involved in, and you're making quick and accurate decisions. You're having to adapt to circumstances in front of you. So both in terms of negotiation and in terms of mediation, I think it's actually been very, very helpful in terms of the way I use my mind when I'm in those situations.
I understand your work as a referee coach has taken you all over the world. Whereabouts have you worked?
Well, most recently, I'm just recently back from the Czech Republic, where I took a small group of referees from the Edinburgh area who were refereeing a match over there, which I was coaching the referee with. But then I did a development session with some of the Czech referees as well. So that was very good. Probably more exotically, in December I was in Barbados, where I was the coach assessor for the Barbados World Rugby Sevens, which was very, very enjoyable as well, I have to say.
Just before we go on, it'd just be good to get a bit more information on your background and your training experience.
Yeah, I've been involved in training, I suppose, ever since I was working as a zoologist. I used to train people on how to identify plants and animals and things like that as part of that job. But I suppose the main thing where I got into the training was actually when I became active in the trade union movement and as a full-time negotiator. where I was the lead person in delivering training for union reps who were covered by our Scottish office. And that built into developing and running courses of my own under my own business. So it was an easy stream through from there.
I understand you recently did the CEDR mediator skills training, and as somebody who was already a very experienced practitioner, how did you find retraining as a mediator with CEDR?
I found it absolutely fascinating, actually. I mean, one of the things is I don't think you can ever be overtrained and overqualified, because you learn from every situation. Just like you learn from every mediation, as long as you reflect back on it. And that's certainly one of the things that the training builds into you, is the discipline of reflecting back. The CEDR training I thought was particularly useful for me because it was based around commercial mediation. And my background and my experience as a mediator is primarily in workplace and employment mediation. So to get into an area that was slightly different meant that I was having to stretch myself a bit. And as soon as you're stretching yourself, you're much more likely to learn more. And I think the wealth of experience that the trainers had was just wonderful in actually helping me to embed that. And
going back to your career a bit, you've had a very interesting and varied one as a trade union negotiator, working in the land management sector, and now with Tretheth doing mediations, training in the employee relations space. Is there one skill that you've developed over the years that you think has stood you in good stead and helped you in these very different and complex situations?
I think probably the key one is a bit of lateral thinking, because when you've got a varied background to draw on, the experiences you have aren't necessarily directly relevant to what you've got in front of you. But if you can do a bit of lateral thinking and sort of think, right, well that worked in that situation, maybe it'll work in this one. So being able to think on your feet and come up with an alternative solution. Although I suppose, part of that also comes from having a discipline of being open to a solution that presents itself as well. And an awful lot of people do close themselves to solutions too early.
Okay. And looking specifically at your time as a trade union negotiator, what is it that's needed to achieve success in this field?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting question, because trade union negotiators are an extremely variable group of people. They all have different skill sets, they all have different attributes, and to be honest, that's partly why it works. It's a bit like CEDR, actually. You look at the composition of CEDR negotiation trainers or CEDR mediators. They're all quite different to each other. And actually that's part of the strength. And I think having the confidence in your own personality and your ability to actually think through problems, I think is part of it. In the trade union movement, you obviously have to be sometimes robust and sometimes soft. So you need to be able to vary your approach depending on the situation that you're looking at. And you also need to be quite persistent. So those are all things that actually overlap quite strongly with mediation as a discipline.
And I can imagine that field, on a number of occasions, you encounter quite entrenched parties, and deadlock is quite a common feature. How is it that you would go about breaking deadlock when it occurs in that field?
Well, I think the key to breaking deadlock is making sure that everybody who's sitting around the table understands what their own interests are. And I think that's something an awful lot of negotiators forget about when they're going in. What is in my best interest is not necessarily the same thing as what I want. And actually getting everybody around the table to understand what is in their interests, then getting them to understand what is in other people's interests. And once you're talking about interests and needs, then perhaps you can start to find some options for a solution there.
And I was speaking to my colleague Philip Williams before we were doing this session. I said, what's the one thing that you would ask Malcolm about his trade union negotiation experience? Yeah. And he says that he remembers having a conversation in which you said that you've worked with both sides of the dispute, with both parties, and that you think there's a real value in upskilling both sides to have a better negotiation. Is that right? And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. Well, I'm quite a strong advocate of what I would describe as management-staff partnership. And the value that people can get, or organisations can get, from the knowledge of their staff and having a good mechanism for accessing it. So actually, when I'm working on that kind of area, delivering training with an employer or whatever, or particularly training in negotiations, I like to do that with both sides of the equation. Partly because what we're talking about is really a long-term relationship. It's a relationship that needs to mature. And if it's a mature relationship, then what they get from that is the ability to disagree in a constructive way. And that instead of having an argument, they have a discussion and they start to explore solutions rather than simply focusing on the problems. I mean, one of the key points in terms of all of that is that every organisation I worked with staff in, the staff's interests are almost exactly the same as that of the management, because everybody wants to work for a thriving organisation. A thriving organisation can afford to pay better terms and conditions and is usually going to be a better employer. So actually, you're talking about developing something that could be to the long-term benefit of the company, of the staff and customers and everybody who's part of that company.
And is it also when individuals are upskilled and they're able to approach negotiations in a more constructive way, they're able to, as Phil would say, or I'm sure a lot of the negotiation trainings here, expand the pie, sort of find out where you can create value that where perhaps it wasn't apparent when you first looked at the dispute or the problem?
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of what it is actually knowing where to find out the information. Because if you go into any negotiation underinformed, then you're probably not going to come out of it with what you perhaps need to come out of it. And as I said earlier, one of the things people often go into underinformed about is what their own interests are. But actually, if they can get the proper information, then actually they can explore a wider range of solutions. And actually then you can start to apply a bit of the lateral thinking. And actually it may be that, for example, if I was negotiating with you, I might be able to identify a solution that delivers your interests that you've never thought of. And similarly, you might be able to do the same for me. And actually, if we're getting both of our interests met, even though they're by ways that we hadn't thought of in the first place, that's still a very successful outcome to that negotiation.
Okay. And if you had one negotiating top tip that you would share with people, and you think that is so fundamental and fundamentally quite basic that you would share with people, what would it be to help have a more successful process?
I would say keep asking questions and keep listening. Because the more you ask questions, the more you listen, the more you understand what's driving the person who you're negotiating with, or the people who you're negotiating with, and the more likely you are to be able to identify a solution. Of course, that does depend on them doing the same with you, so that's where that maturity of the relationship comes in.
Listening skills you talk about, the active listening skills is fundamental to everything that CEDR teaches, whether it's negotiation training or mediation training. And from what I understand, that skill set is transferable to almost any situation when you're engaged in conflict.
Absolutely. Well, and even when you're not engaged in conflict, because actually, asking questions and listening is one of the best ways to avoid going into the conflict. And actually, that's where the real maturity comes in, particularly employment relationships, is in the ability to listen in such a way that you solve problems before they become a dispute, before they become an argument.
And one final thought, Scotland in the 2019 World Cup, out of the group or not?
Well, if I knew that, then I would probably have a lot of money on a bet on it. And I have to say, I'm hopeful for Scotland to play some very good rugby, because that's what we've developed a reputation for doing. Whether that takes us out to the group stage, I can only be as hopeful as anyone else who's a Scot, really. But as always, I'm going to be looking mainly at the referees. So that's kind of where I've gone.
Perfect. Malcolm, thank you very much for talking to us today.
No problem. Thank you.